Okay, good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this UPKRC public lecture. This online event is organized by the University of the Philippines Korea Research Center in partnership with the Ateneo de Manila University Korea Studies Program. I am Carl Ian Uy Cheng Chua from the Ateneo de Manila University, and I will be your moderator for this event. We are delighted to welcome our participants who are joining us in the safety of their homes through UPKRC's YouTube channel. Before we begin our program, we would like to remind our audience on some house rules. You may send your questions and comments throughout the presentations and discussions in the YouTube chat room. The questions will be then collected and answered by our speaker during the open forum. At this point, please allow me to provide a brief background of the organizers of today's program. The UP Korea Research Center was launched in April 2016 to provide Filipino scholars and researchers with opportunities to widen their interests in Korean studies. The center conducts various academic and cultural activities for scholars and professionals and serves as a university-wide hub that promotes and develops Korean studies in the Philippines. For more information and updates on UPKRC, you may please visit their website at Facebook UPKRC. The Ateneo Korean Studies Program was first set up in 2012 as the Ateneo Initiative for Korean Studies. In the following years, KSP was able to expand and grow as an interdisciplinary hub for examining, engaging, and experiencing Korea in the Philippine academia, with the widest course offerings on Korean studies for undergraduate students, covering themes across various disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. Apart from its regular courses, the program likewise offers extramural classes to the public and has similarly pioneered the conduct of regional and inter-university Korean studies outreach seminars, conferences, workshops, and online lectures during this pandemic. Through research and active development of Korea-related courses and programs, both for students and educators, KSP endeavors to promote this critical study of Korea, contribute to the strengthening of Philippine-Korea relations. For more information and updates, you may visit the Facebook page at Ateneo Korea Studies. This afternoon, we are privileged to have our distinguished speaker, Dr. Roald Maliangke, to give us a talk. Professor Maliangke is an associate professor of Korean studies, fascinated by the mechanics of cultural policy and the convergence of major cultural phenomena. Roald analyzes cultural industries, performances, and consumption in Korea from the early 20th century to the present. He's author of Broken Voices, Post-Colonial Entanglements, and the Preservation of Korea's Central Folk Song Traditions, published by the University of Hawaii Press. He's also co-editor of K-Pop, The Traditions, also published by University of Hawaii Press. He's also the co-editor of K-Pop, The International Rise of the Korean Music Industry, my apologies, published by Routledge. To deliver his presentation entitled Accounting for Popular Taste, Neoliberalism in Reality Talent Shows, let us all welcome Dr. Roald Maliangke. Whenever you're ready, please, Roald. You're on mute, Roald.
Typical start of any kind of online presentation. So thank you so much, Professor Chua and the organizers for this wonderful occasion. It's a real pleasure for me to speak to you. So thank you. I will today talk about, as you said, I will talk about the neoliberalism in reality talent shows. And to give you an idea of what I am actually thinking about, I'll show you a little snippet of one such thing. Okay, here we go.
그녀의 정체가 밝혀집니다. 진실 무대야 열려라! K-pop 성기술래 M카 방청객 그는 정말로 노래를 잘하는 실력자일지 아니면 M 카운트다운을 방청 왔다가 그냥 작가분에게 캐스팅된
이별을 일단 한국말은
이제 마치게 듣도록 하겠습니다. 노래 부를 때 봐라 이렇게 부른다. 이렇게 안 부른다. 이렇게 가만히 부른다. 미국인일지 유대인일지 혹은 한국인일지 잠시 후에 공개해드리도록 하겠습니다. 우리 언더걸스 분들께 마지막 한 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
샬롬.
맞잖아, 성지순례.
I will speak in English. Yeah, I really wanted to have a duet with you with Wonder Girls, but it's too bad it didn't happen.
Do you speak Korean at all?
왜 한국말을 안 하지? 근데 자꾸 웃으시는 게 좀 수상하기도 하고.
K-pop 성지순례 M카 방청객 당신의 목소리를 들려주세요. 실력자야. 톤이 안 흔들렸어. 톤이
아니야,
안 흔들렸다.
설마. 오빠 실력자, 오빠가 맞으면 인정. 한국말 잘하는 팬 아니야?
그렇지. 말도 안 돼. 음치야, 음치. K-pop 성지순례 M카 방청객 173명 중에 2분 다 음치였습니다. 가이드인가 가이드.
한국분이 노래를 불러서 립싱크를 하시는 느낌이에요.
유대인 분들이 제일 한국말 잘 따라하시는 거 알죠? 노래 부를 때 봐라 이렇게 부른다. 이렇게 가만히 부른다.
샬롬. 속해요. 순간이 다 지나고 다시 속해요. 순간이 다 지나고 다시 보게 되는 그날
대박이다.
모든 걸 버리고 그대 곁에 서서 남은 길을 가리란 걸 인연이 라고 하죠. 거부할 수가 없죠. 내 생에
대박이네. So over the past decade, reality talent shows have experienced a dramatic surge in popularity on South Korean TV networks. Examples include this one, the one I just showed you, Mnet's I Can See Your Voice, 나의 목소리가 보여. There's a range of other shows that actually kind of came to an end just when this show started to come up. So there's, for example, Superstar K, The Voice of Korea, Produce 101, TVN's Korea's Got Talent, SBS's Survival Edition K-Pop Star, KBS's Top Band and Singing Battle, and NBC's Star Edition The Great Birth. Even Marvel Comics, the new character Luna Snow, the K-pop idol turned superhero, was introduced in 2019, as you can see in the slide, as a member of 4L1T, winners of the Idol Origins contest. Reality talent shows commonly revolve around a small panel of noted individuals judging performances by amateur singers over the course of competitive elimination rounds. As they play into the general public's distrust of the music industry's manipulative power and gatekeeping, viewers are asked to help them break through the glass ceiling and cast their vote either live or online. Meanwhile, the amateur status of the contestants and the name of a show like The Voice of Korea, they fuel the sentiment that they are playing a role in the curatorship of true talent. Viewers invested in particular contestant will spend money voting for and kind of indirectly promoting their favorites. And what is more, the element of competition reminds the viewers of the selection processes that the members of K-pop formations go through, which in turn highlights not only the celebrities' humble beginnings, but perhaps also the theoretical possibility that they, the fans, could be contesting too. Han argues that the talent shows are competitions rather than auditions. He believes that while an audition is a way of assessing how well someone fits a particular role, a competition focuses on how well a predetermined criterion is met. How, in other words, a known song or a song with strong tonality is rendered. The main concern, he says, is who sings the designated song better and who goes up to the higher pitch. But although the element of competition is undeniable and will also play out among the fans, shows equally encourage the audience to assess whether a candidate is fit to win. As important as their voices are the backstories, which serve as evidence of the contestants' authenticity. Critics note that viewers are made to judge based a kind of the singers based on a very limited range of renditions of well-established styles of music. Indeed, following on from Howard Becker's 1982 Art Worlds, perhaps, for the television shows to be successful and for the successful contestants to earn the lucrative rewards that will allow them to commit themselves fully to their artistic ambitions, the undefined criteria for performance cannot completely shun stylistic conventions or be perceived as superimposed. They must emulate existing ones to win the maximum number of votes. The business of popular entertainment favors those with the greatest commercial promise, and despite being predetermined, by seemingly defying the cultural hegemony, the notion of raw talent promotes sales. As Jeremy Gilbert notes, the notion of the innate talent of individuals serves to justify the obviously self-perpetuating nature of inegalitarian institutions and social relations. So the idea, Adorno's idea of pseudo-individualism can be applied both to the business model and the supposed talent of the contestants. The considerable commercial importance of the shows, some shows have generated viewer ratings as high as 20%, can cast doubts upon the validity of the polls. After all, judges and producers may have rather vested interest in selecting contestants who, for better or worse, appeal to a very large percentage of their viewership. When in spite of the format's popularity and reliance on viewer voting, Mnet's producers feared that the 2019 installment of their Produce series would produce an unfavorable outcome, they rigged the voting process. John Fisk defines fandom as the act of appropriating certain performers, narratives, or genres from mainstream pop by a minority. It is, he finds, typically associated with the cultural taste of subordinated formations of the people, particularly with those disempowered.
Roald, I think your slides are not showing. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll try the slides again a little bit later. So while K-pop and talent shows have come under increasing scrutiny of fans, the criticism doesn't immediately pose a challenge to the business model per se. Critics may genuinely oppose aspects of the industry's hegemony and have a significant effect on sales. That's true. But in doing so, they may ultimately be driven by something else, such as a desire to find unity in this common purpose, promote their fandom, and ability for scrutiny, perhaps also compete with fans of other idols. Since it presents an avenue for young people to distinguish themselves, even very strong criticism of talent shows may be geared less towards generating a change in the processes and policies than really generating likes. Pop culture fandom is always aspirational. It yields greater agency to the subordinated, but as in subcultures, the actions are often performative. The majority of critical fans may not seek control over particular media to reverse any subordination, however loud their voices may be. Now, in cultural studies, as well as in many other disciplines, the use of the term neoliberalism has become very common. I find it everywhere. So you can find it in studies of the economy, you can find it in social science, but certainly in cultural studies too. In the study of K-pop, it's been used increasingly in the last couple of years. So it would imply things, it was an economic term, it would imply things such as deregulation, reductions in public expenditure, an emphasis on individual entrepreneurship, competition, free trade, but there are all kinds of problems with the term. And for example, Nick Coldry argues that such strategies that can pose a danger when they promote a worldview that regards a market system as the ideal socio-political form of organization, and allows those principles to drown out alternative criteria. In the workplace, the corporate identity, for example, can indeed risk obfuscating truly individual personal values and experiences. And while one might posit that the self-branding that is so common in pop culture is a triumph of individual expression, Coldry contends that it merely represents the opportunity to compete as a commodity. Since the neoliberal values have become internalized and very much part of our culture, championing a much more introspective and less performative account of the non-market driven needs and emotions of us individuals may actually prove to be quite challenging. The business of pop culture and the business of Korean pop music is driven by neoliberalism in a range of different ways. According to In-kyu Kang, it is responsible for the hyper-commodification and hyper-rationalization of K-pop as evidenced by the creation of talents through years of training, the wide range of spin-offs, and also the use of lip sync. He says the de-individualization of group members and their replaceability within idol formations are kind of very strong examples of this. But neoliberalism can also be identified in another equally important aspect of K-pop, namely the semantics of the performance, the conformity in how the K-pop idols interact with their fans, for example. So again, the absence of true individual emotion or introspection. The phenomenon of some boy bands and girl groups, for example, and I hate to use the word girl group, but that seems to be the common term, can also involve placing emphasis on personal empowerment and symbols of non-conformity. So in a way, sometimes the groups use things that are driven by neoliberalism, essentially, but they still market the product as one that stands for individualism. The first public talent shows were organized in the 1930s. Recognizing, of course, we need to, that the conditions around pop music were radically different at the time, and that Korea's corporate and consumer cultures have changed considerably since, the early prevalence of the shows nevertheless demonstrate that in K-pop at least, public auditions, competitions, and audience participation, business approaches that I closely associate with neoliberalism took root early on. In the first few decades of the 20th century, record companies' primary source of revenue was the sale of physical copies. The wonders of the new media technologies and the foreign scenes and sounds they produced certainly drew in affluent consumers. But as soon as prices began to drop and the size of the middle class began to grow, the business became a dominant feature of daily life. And in Korea too, talent shows, radio broadcasts, and countless advertisements promoting the latest records could be found everywhere. And I'm going to just try to share the slides again. Let's see. And hopefully it's working.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're currently in the 1908 and 1920 slide.
Excellent, thank you. So these are just a random selection of ads that you could find easily in newspapers. The one on the right, the one on the left is actually a record sleeve. This is the 1930s. This is in the very center of what is now Myeongdong, an area kind of mostly popular with Japanese people living in Korea at the time.
Oh, Roald, I think the slides are not moving, so you might need to manually click the slides.
Ah, okay.
There you go.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay, I might leave it like this. So while the elements of cost, sound quality, and uniqueness remained considerable selling points for some time, the growing phenomenon of celebrity stardom eventually turned fandom into a fourth major factor driving sales. Enjoying the accolade of commerceship and cosmopolitanism that their involvement awarded, many young urbanites kept up to date on the activities of their idols and emulated their style. They bought magazines and frequented record shops and popular music venues, including cafes and bars, to remain up to date on the latest developments and share experiences and opinions. So in the 1920s, when popular music starts to be recorded on records, first they start mostly with folk music. You see a range of different styles come up. So the most common or most popular ones are new folk songs, kind of folk songs that are now put to a kind of more Western sounding accompaniment. Yuhenga, which are closer to the kind of also the enka style of music and probably were influenced by that style. And then eventually you also see jazz coming up. By the early 30s, the primary companies competing for a slice of the Korean music market were Columbia and Victor, closely followed in terms of market share by Cheron, Polydor, OK, and Taepyeon. I estimate their total annual income to have hovered around 35 million won around the mid-1930s, equivalent to approximately 350 million US dollars today. Korean pop music accounted for more than half of record sales, and some pop songs, whether foreign or Korean, sold thousands of copies almost overnight. But like today, due to the high cost of production, record companies rarely took chances. While nudity had long proven to sell live acts regardless of any artistic talent, gramophone recordings had to ideally be sold before they ended up on the shelves. Music fandom grew considerably in the 1930s, but few contemporary publications discuss the phenomenon in detail. The first use of the English term fan, pen, in regard to admirers of pop culture in Korea may be in the Japanese language paper Busan Nippo from June 1925, which reported that fans in Busan, presumably all Japanese, were excited about the arrival of actress Teruko Makino. Another, from December 1926, referred to Korean followers of Hollywood star Rudolph Valentino. The term fan retained its association with things foreign for some time, and it was still placed between quotation marks, like these, in an editorial on pop music a decade later. While it was used to refer to sports fans too, when it was applied to pop music, not a realm dominated by men, it appears to have carried negative connotations. The many complaints by Koreans over the ill effects of modern urban culture in the early 30s show that some believed pop music was having a drug-like effect on Korean youth, with gramophone technology often receiving partial blame. It is ironic that criticism of the medium took decades to come to the fore, and that when it finally did, due of course in part to the emergence of print media, Koreans were playing a greater role in the record industry than ever before, as all the record companies up until the late 20s, early 30s were completely Japanese owned. Not only were the Koreans increasingly involved in the production of records, both behind the scenes and in front of the microphone, but even the voice of Korean fans had become difficult to ignore. Many fans wrote letters to their idols, followed them around after performances, sent gifts like cosmetics or chocolate, and they sometimes demanded that the radio play their favorite music. Indeed, in 1940, pop singer Kim Young-sung acknowledged that today's fans of pop music have certainly become more knowledgeable and better at their hobby. What is more, despite growing criticism of the involvement of giseng and young entertainment women in pop culture, which extended even to their use of fashion accessories, record company and the radio provided talented giseng better career opportunities that they had ever had. Unlike giseng, who could rely on their management to provide introductions, talented singers with no ties to the music industry could make a name for themselves by winning a prize at a contest. The idea may not have been adopted from abroad, but if it was, it certainly shows that Korea's entertainment industry followed on the heels of developments elsewhere. The 1935 Hollywood production Every Night at 8, about a singing trio trying to break through using an amateur radio hour, was the first to piggyback on the popularity of the amateur hour concept in the United States. In the UK, in Japan, where Every Night at 8 opened in April 1936, and in China too, talent shows were becoming a regular feature on the radio. In Hong Kong in January 1932, the chairman of the Broadcasting Committee issued an invitation to local talent for a singing contest. And in Shanghai in November 1935, an amateur contest was organized with the help of several local radio stations with the support of the RCA Victor Record Company. Running over the course of a week and decided on by the listeners based on so-called popular vote, it sought to support talented contestants and in the process, points to all the stars who began at the bottom. In Korea now, from October 1933, for approximately 6 months, Columbia Records organized a pop music singing contest in 10 cities across the country with a record contract on the line, as well as the possibility of an additional acting gig with the Japanese film studio Shochiku Kinema. It was the first in a line of similar contests that sought to recruit new talents and raise revenue. Indeed, the events promoted the company's brand name and their association with talent, and sometimes sales of a particular hit song or recital. Sponsoring Columbia Records contest was the Chosunilbo, the Korea Daily, which sought to increase sales through regular updates on the proceedings and presented the contestants to its readers with a photo in its first major announcement. The events were held in the evening, and each week allowed for only 3 contestants to sing one particular song and one of their own choosing. Lee Jung-jang notes that because pop music still lacked the reputation of Western classical music at this time, only noted specialists of the latter genre were asked to serve as judges. So we had Professor Mary Young of Ewha College, Professor Kim Young-hyun of Yeonhee College, and pianist and soprano Sung Duk-yoon. Eventually, at the finals held on February 17, 1934, stars Il Kyung-jung and Bok Soo-go came in respectively first and second place. And you can see them here. So at the top, you have Il Kyung-jung, and then at the bottom, you have Mr. Bok Soo-go. And if you look at the ad, this was basically issued, the ad was issued roughly 2 months after they won the contest. So clearly the record company had immediately put them to work, so they were riding the high of their popularity. The success of the scheme prompted other record companies to follow suit. After similar contests had been held by OK in 1935, 1936, and Victor in early 1939, on July 29, 1939, Young Records announced another nationwide contest, again in collaboration with the Korea Daily. But this time the judges were actually notable figures from the pop music scene, such as composer Ki Han-jun and lyricist Ato Jun. Finalists had to sing Kyuyot Chae's hit song, Bukuk 5,000 kilo, the northern country's 5,000 kilometers, which the company had released in January that year, as well as one song that they could choose themselves. A few months later, it was Polydor Japan's turn to organize a nationwide new singer contest. And this time with the support of another newspaper, the Dongailbo, or East Asia Daily. The contest again played out over 6 months, but the repertoire was now fully predetermined and comprised songs released by Polydor in the year prior. 3 particular songs for male contestants and 3 for female ones. Judging again was done by new kind of celebrities of the pop music scene. In 1942, then, Taepyeong Records announced what would eventually be the last of these national pop music singing contests. Noted vocalists who were so-called discovered through these talent shows included the 2 talents I've mentioned, as well as Se Jang-jang, Kun Ja-jo, Bang Nam-jin, and Nana Baek. Hae Che finds that successful singers like Bok Soo-go would generally enjoy a greater reputation than their female counterparts. Although the neoliberal nature of the contest, the idea that anyone could be a star, was intriguing, the negative perception of Kiseng persisted, and not because the young women's music training gave them an unfair advantage. Despite the prevalence of Kiseng in everyday life and the high salaries of some former Kiseng turned pop stars, the association of Kiseng with pop music still kind of tainted the latter for quite some time. But while the Kiseng past of female stars was rarely celebrated, despite the rigorous training that they had undergone, women's working class backgrounds could actually work in their favor as long as it didn't call their virtuousness into question. And so, for example, you see that one contestant, Se Jong-jang, was discovered while working at a sales girl at the Hwasin department store in Pyongyang. Many of these girls working at the department stores, young women, were selected based on their looks. So that could have actually been a plus, the fact that she was working at a department store. Similar to the popular Korea's Got Talent like TV shows of today, the contest entailed the public auditioning of contestants performing a limited range of music in pop styles in front of a panel comprised of people working for the record company and a collaborating entertainment agency or record company. The range of well-established pop songs was much more limited at the time. So in order to promote their own productions and have them regarded as the standard, contestants were required to cover the record company's own hit songs. So from a marketing point of view, there's little that could go wrong. But the commercial importance of the talent show still cast doubts upon the selection criteria applied. Ironically, despite its own involvement in the formula from the start, in April 1940, the Korea Daily published an editorial that criticized the commercialism of the talent shows, arguing that it was wrong of the companies to ask contestants to buy 2 records and pay a participation fee, which they did. Since it didn't mention which company it had in mind, probably this was aimed at Taepyeong Records and Polydor, who had both done this very recently. A month later then, the paper published another critique of the shows, this time one that focused on the absence of proper criteria and bias towards pretty female contestants and those with aegyo. And if you look carefully, you can see aegyo here in the ad. Criticism of the alleged bias was likely fueled by the look of female contestants frequently coming up in public discourse as well as by the faces of both male and female entertainers having been customarily printed on flyers, newspaper advertisements, and posters since the mid-20s. Since the emphasis on the look of female entertainers was not limited to the shows or the record industry, a critique like the one published could not have much effect. And indeed, when you look at a newspaper report on the last of the shows, again, none of the criteria are listed. So it could not have much effect. Critics of the talent shows and the social hierarchies could not overturn their role as consumers, let alone their status as colonized subjects. They were reminded of this on May the 22nd, 1933, when the government issued the gramophone record regulations, which saw many albums banned on account of them being disturbing or immoral, very vague categories. But the shared recognition of raw talent, that subjective social standard that had been cultivated over years, may have felt a little magical. Although the format invited the opinions of privileged citizens too, the audience's efforts to serve cultural justice by giving recognition to amateur music talents served to bring the colonized together over matters of taste, their taste. The shows were premised, after all, on individual mastery in their pop culture. Especially living under colonial rule, finding commonalities in defiance of the political hegemony of the colonial government would have been gratifying. Apart from the element of public scrutiny, the talent show's native embedding of authenticity was also crucial. Although the record industry had not yet been hit by major controversies or scandals, the decades-long seeming absence of the general public's immediate participation will have led some to question the notion of popular entertainment, despite the involvement of Koreans, eventually, in the creative production process. So in spite of Koreans having no control over any particular medium or genre, and despite the judging catering to a Korean audience, the talent shows were a platform for uniquely Korean sentiments, and they highlighted the potential of the subordinated. That finalists would have a chance of success with Japanese and Japanese colonial subjects overseas was important to the Korean self-image. But although an article in the Mail Symbol from June 1925 still boasted that Korean vocal music will reverberate in foreign ears, the reality was that outside of Korea, very few people were actually interested in Korean renditions of Western jazz, for example. Only a handful of Korean stars enjoyed success in Japan, where in 1940, Korean music made up less than 2 to 3% of all the records produced. While a few Korean virtuosos were able to briefly escape their colonial subjectivity in Japan by working under a pseudonym, Western audience would not look beyond their ethnicity. Korean foremost celebrity, dancer Choi Seung-hee, for example, found that foreign audiences did not care much for Asian performers performing Western dance in original or adapted forms. And here, in spite of her performance comprising a wide range of styles, this article says that the people in the West preferred genuine Oriental, whatever that means, musical accompaniment, which caused her to have to scramble to find the right people to accompany her. So as these examples demonstrate, fandom in colonial Korea comprised a very complex range of emotions and aspirations that deserves a lot more kind of careful attention than I pay it here. Apart from infatuation with the celebrity or the social distinction that music could provide, from early on, pop music fandom was driven by the beauty of the melodies and the lyrics and its association with a modern Western view, a view of life. Fandom was liberating as it appealed to modern sensibilities around class, gender, and community. By lending them a voice and highlighting their economic and cultural capital, fandom gave fans a sense of empowerment. Despite the occasions on which foreign companies acknowledged either the talent of a Korean pop star or the importance of their Korean fans being few and far between, they allowed them to imagine a connection to peers outside their social circle and provided opportunities to collect experiences and items that quickly grew in prestige. Some female singers did indeed become very successful, although misogyny prevailed. Some Koreans were concerned over the degrading effect of, for example, Giseng's prominence on the sanctity, if there was any such thing, of Korean pop entertainment. But concerns like that did not seem to be applied to traditional forms of entertainment equally, which is ironic. It may, though, be that the traditional forms of music did not invite comparison with Japanese or Western entertainment, and it may be because of the notion that women trained as courtesans ought not to represent modern Korea. It is ironic, in a sense, because eroticism had helped promote Korean pop culture among both Koreans and Japanese for a few decades at least, and it frequently relied on association with the Giseng institutions. There were few opportunities to become a professional entertainer, but already in the 1920s, aspiring artists managed to cultivate their unique performing skills and land contracts by way of private auditions, public talent shows, and radio gigs. The small to medium-sized events groomed talent to serve both Korean and foreign audiences, singing songs in Korean and Japanese with communication skills and looks undoubtedly playing a very important role. Once they secured a record contract, their lives could change dramatically. When Columbia chose to organize its own show nationwide, it didn't announce any judging criteria. It wanted the audience to become involved and intended to use the momentum that the shows were building to sell records. The judges were mostly kind of industry insiders, or at least part of an elite circle of music experts. And as such, they were very well aware of the commercial risk involved in voting against the unwritten criteria. By collaborating with major newspapers, the companies involved had nigh full control over the selection process and outcome. Audience members will have had their share of criticism, but they had no public outlet for their voice. Since the few critical editorials that made it to print targeted no record company by name, they may have served to promote as much as discredit the shows that were still running. It's a little bit like the Streisand effect. After liberation, music talent shows did not disappear, but those that ran did so without the involvement of any major record company or media outlet. Most of the cultural industry had been decimated because of the war, would be decimated because of the war, and were decimated also by the lack of funds. Record sales were small, and the only radio station to frequently play pop music was that of the, of course, here I'm talking about the 1950s, the American Forces Network Korea, AFKN. Rather than using amateur radio shows as a springboard, aspiring artists would audition privately with the entertainment division of the 8th United States Army in Korea, where good movement and showmanship outweighed musical skill, which may be an essential element of those auditions. Successful entertainers could land a gig headlining the prestigious Walker Hill shows, which ran from 1962 to 2002, or even appear on TBC's highly popular TV program Show, which ran from 1964 to 1983. That the latter often featured talents from the military circuit too was due to their ability to move well on stage and thus on camera. Rather than good musicianship, therefore, from the 1960s, Korean pop music began to prioritize good movement and showmanship, a development that was fostered partly by the expressiveness of the Western music genres that were becoming popular through the military circuit. The cultural and political importance of the military entertainment circuit is exemplified by Korean pop idols, the Kim sisters, migrating eventually to the United States in kind of pursuit of their dream, and of a neoliberal capitalist model of economic development that foregrounds individualism rather than defiance of any hegemonic superstructure. But Koreans would eventually develop a major global entertainment industry of their own, Hallyu. And it is Hallyu's hegemony that industry's own talent shows are now supposedly meant to rectify. Today's talent shows retain many of the elements of control: the lack of clear criteria, the record contract on the line, the momentum built over months of auditions, and the involvement of major media outlets. Among some of the new elements are the primacy of contestants' backgrounds and the selection of judges, we know this all too well, based on their ability to give strong, often highly theatrical performances in supporting or critiquing performances. While the socio-political conditions of today's shows are vastly different from those in the past, the notion of talent remains kind of largely unquestioned. Despite criticism of commercial products and kind of schemes being so commonplace, the talent shows are supported by the backstories or backgrounds, evidence of authenticity, and they continue to compel viewers to participate in the voting process in the interest of preserving kind of true merit-based selection. Indeed, in their 2012 study of China's Supergirl contest, Jeroen de Kloet and Stefan Lamperger write, the production of the authentic self propagated by the show is deeply embedded in neoliberal fantasies about self-fulfillment that are often intricately linked to consumerism. While the desire to generate greater control over one's pop culture may be less than it was under colonial rule, deciding with many others over the presumed authenticity and quality may allow voters to find unity in a common purpose, promote their fandom and ability for scrutiny, and compete with fans of other idols. Ironically then, the format does represent the voices and aesthetics of the majority, and it provides genuine business opportunities to individual artists. I suspect, therefore, that we may see this format return in full force again in perhaps a century from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Roel. Maybe if you could, your previous slide, in your previous presentation, you showed some clips. Unfortunately, we weren't able to see them because it was covered by the slides. So if you could kindly show them briefly.
Okay, let me see. So was that were you able to see the first video clip? Was that okay? Oh, you weren't able to. I'm so sorry. So that was the most fun one. So allow me to just, I'll show that to you again. Hopefully it'll work this time. All right, here we go.
그녀의 정체가 밝혀집니다. 시시 무대야! 야야라! 야야라! K-pop 성지순례 엠카 방청객. 그들은 정말로 노래를 잘하는 실력자일지 아니면 M 카운트다운을 방청 왔다가 그냥 작가분에게 캐스팅된
이별을 일단 한국말로
이제 밝게 드리도록 하겠습니다. 노래 부를 때 봐라 이렇게 부른다. 이렇게 안 부른다. 이렇게 가만히 부른다. 미국인일지 유대인일지 혹은 한국인일지 잠시 후에 공개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 우리 원더걸스 분들께 마지막 한 말씀 부탁드리겠습니다.
Shalom.
맞잖아, 성지순례.
I will speak in English. Yeah, I really wanted to have a duet.
So just to explain, the idea is here that they get a contestant and they have to figure out whether this is a true singer or not, whether they can actually pull it off properly or not, or whether they are merely a pretty person.
당신의 목소리를 들려주세요. 실력자야. 음치 톤이 안 흔들렸어. 톤이 안
아니야,
흔들렸다.
설마. 오빠 실력자, 오빠가 맞으면 인정. 한국말 잘하는 팬 아니야? 팬?
그렇지. 말만 해. 음치야, 음치. K-pop 성지순례 엠카 방청객 173명 중에 2분 다 음치였습니다. 가이드인다, 가이드.
한국 분이 노래를 불러서 립싱크를 하시는 느낌이에요.
유대인 분들이 제일 한국말 잘 따라하시는 거 알죠? 노래 부를 때 봐라, 이렇게 부른다, 이렇게 가만히 부른다.
촬영.
말만 해. 음치야, 음치.
익숙해요 순간이 다 지나고 다시 익숙해요 순간이 다 지나고.
So, and this is what I mean with that kind of very theatrical reaction that the judges are kind of selected for, their ability to pull that off.
그대 곁에 서서 남은 길을 가리란 걸 인연이.
All right, this was another slide. So this is from the, it came out in 2019 as a Marvel Comics, where again, so it's, they kind of emphasize here that the, yeah, a lot of them come through the system, having kind of given, been given a chance to shine, and having true talent is kind of what is implied here by way of a talent show. And I think that's where it stopped, right? And then you couldn't follow the rest. Okay, good.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Roald, for the insightful and very comprehensive presentation. It's actually quite interesting because you're basing it on quite historical, or at least relatively historical concepts, which is also like a theatrical concept for us. It's like we're waiting for the contemporary fandoms, and then we're getting all of this historical bits, which is quite actually fascinating. And I will have some quite curious questions regarding it. We are currently going to be moving on to our open forum. And this session will now open for questions and comments from either both the chats and from the YouTube channel itself. So if our audiences have questions, feel free to ask. We just have one question before I move to my own questions. If the motivations of these reality shows are really deep, then specifically for the likes of Produce 101 series, why are the groups not being made permanent?
So I assume it's a very good question. So, but I assume that this means this is questioning why particularly very successful group formations aren't made permanent. Well, this does happen, right? Bigger groups are very complex, but smaller groups do sometimes actually come through the system. It's more like duos, sets of 2 or 3 sometimes, but it is complex because as you can appreciate, the groups that are selected offer a range of qualities. And when people audition, they are selected only on the basis of their voice and their performanceship, which are very important. But it is not the only set of criteria. They like to have one member who speaks English very well, then ideally more. They would like to have, for a group, they would like to have people who perhaps speak Japanese or Chinese. They also like someone who has a bit of a leadership role and takes that on quite comfortably. Sometimes, as most people will know, that rotates, which I think is very good. but it certainly helps if there are certain strengths in the group that basically divide up the responsibilities a little bit when groups travel. So for that reason, just proper, let's say, just beautiful voices and beautiful, let's say, faces may not cut it for a lot of agencies.
Thank you. Before I move on to the other questions, I just have a very curious question here, because you started with the historical development of all of these reality shows, talent shows, and so on. And if we put it with the frame of a neoliberal approach, it means that the domestic market has the capacity to actually contain, or at least sustain, this form of consumption. And at least me, coming from a Japanese studies perspective, Japan has a very large market, and that was why it was very much fine, even historically, for it to approach all of its talent within a neoliberal concept. From what you have discussed, especially in its historical concepts and up to the present, did Korea have that market? Because what we do see right now is, for Korean entertainment to survive, it actually had to, look outside. So how do you actually work within that concept, within the neoliberal lens?
It's a great question. Thank you. I believe the time was right for the Korean entertainment world to come up with acts that were genuine. I think there was, and that created the market, because as you can imagine, a lot of people watch this on their phones. They don't even watch it at home on a television anymore, or even on a laptop. They watch it on the fly, so to speak. I think it's called snack culture. And this snack culture means that people can certainly follow things a bit more easily, but that doesn't mean things do not, indeed, as you suggest, do not require a real interest, a real market. And Korea, I think, was ripe for this. So about 12, I think it's about 12 years ago, roughly now, the Korean industry, for example, recognized that a lot of their products were starting to look too similar, and that they needed to diversify. And so they came up with, especially in terms of their female groups, they came up with groups that had a bit more street cred. In addition to that, I think still people wanted to have stuff that really had singing talent, because quite often when you go to a K-pop concert, you can tell that the singing is so-so. And the performance is fantastic, but the singing can be a bit disappointing. So I think there was a real market. So in a way, it feeds back into K-pop too. So it's what's the word? Like you kill, what is it? Two birds with one stone, in a sense, because by having these contests, the idea is created that a lot of the K-pop idols may have also kind of gone through a similar style selection process. And it gives a sense of authenticity to the K-pop groups, which is really what the industry needed.
Great, thank you. Actually, after watching the video again, there was a question here, and maybe it's somewhat related as well with how these are developed, right? We do know that in the back end, it's not just Koreans that are producing these people, but it's a multinational industry. But the question works within the idea of how open is the industry, probably the Korean industry, to foreigners who have this increasing desire to be idols, especially after consuming these types of reality shows, where the Korean media, especially Hallyu, has now actually moved not only towards domestic consumption, but actually sells more towards transnational consumption itself, which basically sells the dream and expands this neoliberal consumption.
Well, it's an excellent question, and one that I don't think I can answer, but I've thought about it because it's coming up a lot in discussions around K-pop. more and more people in the US are now getting into it. They're doing the dance, they follow the music, they want to perform as well, as you can see in this snippet with the woman from Israel. And it's become more and more, increasingly so, indeed. So what does the K-pop industry want with all this extra talent? I suppose they want people to feel they can be involved, and that's very important. There's this, for example, I once wrote an article about the uniformity of K-pop groups, and there was this interesting article by Cyrus, who went through and basically discussed girl groups in the US in the 1960s. And she said the reason they all looked the same in those days is because they wanted the fans to feel that they could be one of them. So the kind of replaceability, in a sense, was a key part of that whole image. And so the K-pop industry will have to think very carefully around on the one hand, preserving their uniqueness, in a sense, because there has to be a hierarchy, I believe. You have to have the real K-pop, because obviously China is also now starting to copy and paste, in a sense. And it sounds more negative than I mean that. Chinese performers are also keen to do their own thing, and they have a right to do that. And so and of course, K-pop is not completely Korean either, but the whole concept, I guess, is. So, Japanese, Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese groups are probably ready to go as well. So how does K-pop preserve a certain, I guess, preserve its hegemony? That is by allowing in, I guess, sometimes foreign singers, but not too readily. I think they'll try to preserve a certain hierarchy, that the real groups will have to have members who speak, for example, fluent Korean. That has to be there. Korean language is probably key to a foot in the door, both practically and, I guess, in terms of the representing what a lot of them do. They become kind of cultural ambassadors and representing Korea.
Okay.
It's complex, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it's really this very interesting concept of, yeah, you're selling the dream, but will that dream actually work for someone that's fulfilling, or at least spending a lot of its money on that industry, right? Another question here, which is somewhat related to my previous question as well. When Korea was liberated, you did mention that there were several girl groups that were created. And they were very much westernized, they were very much Americanized. And because of probably the domestic markets in Korea were not as keen, or probably not as large, there was this move towards America, or at least there was a lot of these entertainers that wanted to actually move to larger entertainment spaces. Unfortunately, these were not as successful, right? Given that it's just basically selling the American dream, which was not fulfilled during that time. However, in the recent time, we do see this movement, especially with BTS. So how do you then see the domestic dream machine in this case? Does that mean that success in the West is ultimate success? Or is domestic success already satisfactory for them?
Yes, that's another great question. And that's why I smile. It's really good so thank you. I suppose, so of course, the times are different. In the so if you think about the 1950s, the Koreans had no money. So for a group of girls to make money, the American scene was too easy almost, because for various reasons. So they could make some money. It wasn't much, but enough to survive. 60s and 70s and 80s, you do see girl groups, but they are apart from a few exceptions, they are not that successful. And those that are successful tend to be family. So they are sisters, actual sisters. They were also called sisters of Zhong sisters, Yi sisters, Pearl sisters, but they were actually relatives. And that was, again, for quite important for the various practical reasons. Some of them made reasonable money, but then obviously Korea is very conservative overall, still is. And so a lot of them would marry and then be more or less forced out of the entertainment industry, which for a long time had still a little bit of a negative image. Today, so when I remember watching David Letterman and Girls' Generation came up, and it was, to me, it was a complete failure of Girls' Generation. David Letterman did everything he could to make it interesting, and the performance itself was perfect, but somehow it just fell flat. And I think that has certainly woken up a lot of people in Korea who feel that once you've actually mastered, as they have now done, right, BTS performing in Grand Central Station, the American market, yes, perhaps that is now the new yardstick. But of course, also interesting is that America is no longer that kind of wondrous land that it was in the past. Right? The Kim sisters were portrayed in the 1960s as the model migrants in Korea, because they managed, they had made it big in the United States, and you will not see that anymore. Koreans are very well aware of the many problems there are in the United States, and they are now thinking, and of course this is a process that started roughly 20 years ago when richer Koreans were starting to think of migrating back to Korea. I think a lot of people would still see Korea now as a wonderful place to live if you can afford it. And so I assume that while they do want to professionally still break through in America, it's a bit divided. So it's professional, not in terms of your life and your I guess, utopia. America is no longer utopia. It is the yardstick for Western success. So it's kind of a difference. Sorry, it was a very long answer.
Yeah, no worries. Actually, just a supplementary question, if the audience doesn't mind. Do you think gender also is involved here, given that, well, we're looking at, as your example works with Girls' Generation versus BTS, and we also look at consumption, where we do, well, some popular culture literature would actually look at how female consumption is actually much more stronger than male consumption itself. So do you think that has a relation as well?
Yes, it has to. The gender always plays a role, and I'm sure it does here too. Yes, because some of the discussions I've had with peers in the United States as well, it was around the masculinity, in fact, kind of literally the muscles of Korean entertainers these days, the kind of Jinsung type entertainers who were performing in kind of American settings alongside American dancers. And so they've managed that quite well. Women, I see not so much performing alongside Western women. And it's not something I've looked at much before, but it's a really good question, because I am sure that, again, we are looking at male and female groups. It's mostly groups, right? Differently. I'm sure we are. I'm sure I'm guilty of that too. But unfortunately, yes, yeah, I would think so. But I can't answer in detail. I'm sure.
Sure, no worries. We have another question here. Hallyu 3.0 aims to bring out the music industry system to overseas and manufacture K-pop influenced local bands in various countries. especially in Southeast Asia. The agenda is clear yet ambitious, and there are some reservations to see K-pop invading the respective local markets abroad, even if that will bring so much profits and will most probably contribute to the development of local markets. For instance, Korean-trained boy bands in the Philippines. What do you think about this phenomena?
It's a wonderful phenomenon that I thought, because I was following a couple of Indonesian acts, Korean-trained Indonesian acts just a few years ago, and they were so good. I was surprised to see that it didn't have the success that I thought it would have, but I believe that one of the challenges is that the aesthetics of Koreans, the physical aesthetics, are considered the standard for a lot of K-pop fans. So you can, for example, if you imagine me 50, not 50, let's say 30 years ago with a lot of makeup and a lot of cosmetic surgery performing, you would be disappointed because I'm not Korean. And I think that will still be there. So even if there is a lot of support from Korean companies, and even if they do speak Korean, I think ultimately people are looking for a little bit of exoticism. That's probably the second part of my answer. They first of all, they want kind of the real thing, and they probably also want something that is not local. And because that makes their fandom more interesting. If they can translate to their friends what a set of lyrics means, for example, that adds very positively to their person. And so I see that here in Australia. So we have a lot of, let's say, local fans, men and women who are really into K-pop. And we have a lot of students. Actually, right now behind me, there's a group of students from Australia, very Australian-looking students. And they're all studying Korean language behind me, and they're all very keen on Korean popular culture. But it's because I think part of the attraction is that it's not local. So that would be,
Great. Thank you. This is actually tied up to the neoliberal concept that you were bringing up. How do you perceive the agency of multi-stans, or people who belong to multiple fandoms? They practice snack culture and are vulnerable to economic exploitation too. So can you comment on that?
Yeah. It's not something I've thought about that much, but I've seen all the various descriptions of fans, and the problem with words like stan is that the word fan is built in. Whereas when I look at people around me, including my students, some people I wouldn't call fans, they are keen followers, which isn't the same thing to me. So that means that they can also switch from one group to the other quite easily. It's simply because their girlfriend maybe or boyfriend is really into it. They follow, they enjoy the community that they enter and are happy to follow. But then, what makes someone a fan? I'm not so sure. For me, it doesn't mean that you cannot be passionate about several people and that there has to be some kind of competition. But I understand that for some people, that is an important element. I would like a little bit, and I talk about this with my students here as well, I would like a little bit more insight into the various terminologies that I used. I'll leave it there. I think it's tricky to use one term for so many people. I think there's a lot of diversity there.
Okay, thank you. Just a little bit of follow-up to tease this idea slightly. While you do begin with sort of separating the idea of fan actions from follower actions, there is a possibility as well of instigating consumption with followers, right? And this is where we then work within the problematic neoliberal concept, right? Because they're not necessarily interested, but they are with people who are interested, yet they are forced to consume it, or at
Yes.
least have some minor consumption in it as well. So how does this category then work?
Yeah. I find actually, so first of all, this phenomenon is not new. When I'm probably one of the somewhat older people today here, and so I was born in the 60s. And when I grew up, there were a lot of people who had very flexible idea around fandom. They could be, and because that's something else, right? You can be a fan of one group one week and the next week be a fan of another group. That happened when I was a kid, and it still happens. So fans and followers, yeah, follower is a term I'd love to see a little bit more, because that implies that people are part of a community and that they are getting their information from sources that they trust, which is very close to conformity, right? Where conformity means not resistant to change. It just means that you rely on particular sources of information, and that you will follow those. Not always blindly, but that's basically the most time economic and sometimes money economic way of staying kind of with the group that gives you the best sense of identity. So there's also an interesting study of Dallas fans done by I think Dutch Chinese woman back in the I think it was mid 1980s. And in that study, she talks about fans and followers and the difference between the people, and that because Dallas was such a terrible drama, but it was also so addictive, that she looked at how the fans had developed ways of dealing with criticism of their fandom, and how followers had also developed ways of talking about stuff they kind of had to follow because of their boy or girlfriend. So anyone who's interested should look that up. So it's yeah, a study of Dallas and fandom. It's kind of funny too. So an excellent study.
Great. This is actually quite interesting for me. If you don't mind me asking another follow-up question. So in Japan, there is the concept of what's that mixed media mix, right? And while in US fandom, as you mentioned with Dallas, the Dallas fandom is just essentially about fans conversing with each other and probably, going into particular events, paid events, whatever, right? But media mix is a very different animal altogether, and that has been seen not only in Japan but also particularly in Korea with a lot of these groups. And the levels of consumption that is then being done here, even for fans, it's extreme, and then for followers, as you were sort of teasing it right now, there is some level of consumption. So how does this then work within this frame that you're currently pushing?
To be honest, I've not heard of the media mix or the mixed media environment. So I'm a bit hesitant to comment, but yes, I think so. One thing I would look into if I were to try to answer this appropriately, I think one thing is important, that is the conditions of fandom and followers. So the word stan, for example, is used everywhere, but it will have a different meaning everywhere too. And so fans and followers, so for example, in Japan will be different too, especially if you're talking about Japanese fans of Korean popular culture, and Korean fans of Korean popular culture. So I'm not really sure, because I wasn't familiar with this term what it really entails. But I would be very interested in how the Korean fans engage with their own pop culture, because that would be quite interesting to observe.
Great. Thank you. This is sort of moving a little bit back to a previous question we had, and it's related to the same question on foreigners, particularly participating in this Korean industry. What about I'm not sure what the term is in Korean, but in Japanese we have the hafus. So
Yeah.
essentially mixed children of mixed marriages, which means that you're now creating this imagery of exoticism because you're representing another half and you're ethnically Korean.
Yes.
How are these now related to the industry? Because foreigners, as you mentioned, there seems to be some gatekeeping, but what about these hafus?
Very good question. Of course it exists, and for a very long time, I think there was a considerable amount of racism in Korea towards hafus. In recent years, I haven't seen too many such examples. There are some, and it's a lot better than it used to be. So I think they are being welcomed in general, because sometimes they look, they can look more attractive or more interesting than perhaps, let's say, whatever normal is, someone who doesn't look mixed, because we're all mixed to a degree. I think Koreans are much less mixed than, for example, I am, I think, but ultimately, of course, it's a degree, and I suppose it will depend, again, with the particular person, to what degree they look foreign as well. And I suppose that also applies to their demeanor and their way of speaking. And I was surprised in the snippet that I shared today, the way in which the audience is commenting on the young woman from Israel is very critical. So they obviously they're contemplating, she looks a certain way, but when she is unable to speak Korean, there seems to be a fair amount of criticism. So, and that's something I've encountered in Korea as well, that in order to be accepted, you really do need to speak the language. So with the hafus in Korea, I would imagine that they are going to be judged a little bit harsher still. But if they play the game well enough, there's probably good opportunities. But I must admit, I haven't seen any recently that kind of really stood out to me as being foreign or half foreign.
Thank you. Just to remind our audience that we still have about 5 minutes to entertain questions. I just have one more question for Roald, if you allow me. So this is where it becomes curious, because both in East Asia, there seems to be this primacy towards the stars moving out, right? That's why BTS, and not just stars, even sports athletes and so on. And local media, when I say local media here, Korean media, probably in Japanese media as well, they seem to go wild when these stars speak in English. Right? In these interviews. So how does this then work? Because there seems to be this non-reception to foreigners, yet there seems to be this excitement towards them moving out.
Yes, very good. This has to be a very layered question, as well as a very layered answer. But yeah, so one thing I've always argued for a long time is that, for example, whenever Koreans are proud of foreigners engaging with Korean products, it is because they are proud of themselves and their culture. It doesn't just give them kind of joy per se, I think. And so when, for example, when the Korean government is sponsoring a lot of performances of K-pop abroad, it is ultimately intended to show the excited audience to the Koreans back home. And so I see that also with a lot of the sports events, that they are very proud that, for example, some of the soccer players are phenomenal and that they're doing so well at a game that for a long time was not really considered a place for Koreans. And yet now they're at the very top. And so yeah, there's a kind of a lot of pride built into these things. But you're right. At the same time, they're quite kind of protective of what it means to be Korean. And I guess that comes partly from decades of kind of cultural policy and public information. But it probably comes also from the enormous pressure that people are under in Korea to have, let's say, a comfortable life. It is hard work. You have to study really hard, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think there's a little bit of protectionism in a sense going on there as well, in addition to a kind of nationalism, which can also be a positive thing, by the way. But certainly a nationalism that was fed by the military governments of the past decade. Previous decade.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Roald. Thank you very much to Roald, and let's give him a virtual round of applause for this very interesting and answering a lot of our very challenging questions. Thank you to everyone for actively participating and giving these thought-provoking questions, especially to our to Roald. And it was a great opportunity for us to engage in fandom from a very academic perspective, and at least it positions and makes us think further about this space. And this concludes not only our open forum, but also our talk. We hope to see you in our next lectures in April. And for more updates on this and future events by our organizers, you may visit the Facebook page of UP Korea Research Center at UPKRC and its YouTube channel. With that, we formally conclude this afternoon session. But before that, for those that are watching us via our YouTube channel, we are posting an evaluation link so that we can hear more and we can develop more ideas towards what types of topics this event can go on with the future. So this is to formally conclude this afternoon session, and we thank everyone for participating and enjoy and have a nice day.